Tonight, we join the chaos on Christmas Eve as a family reunion turns into a supernatural showdown with mischievous goblins, animated decorations, and a magical song. And in the end, we'll find out who gets exactly what they want for Christmas, which I'm sure is being alive.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's the Friday before Christmas, and I have a very, very special gift for you. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and welcome back as we're heading into the final stretch of this very eventful holiday season here at Weekly Spooky. I hope you've enjoyed all the bonus content and scary stories that help keep your holiday very merry and very scary. And I want to let you all know that tomorrow, Saturday the 21st, we have a special episode of Do You Even Movie where we talk all about the 2015 horror Christmas film Krampus. You won't want to miss it, and you get it a few days earlier than normal. So enjoy that, and I want to also mention, on Monday we head back to Strickfield for High Beams on Christmas, and on Christmas Eve we have one more novella from Strickfield. So, you won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting apps and leave us a 5-star rating. It really means a lot to us. I also want to remind you, you can send me an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. And if you want to support us in a very direct way, you can go to weeklyspooky.com/join. For as little as $1 a month, you get 2 bonus shows every single month, exclusive audiobooks, and 2 years worth of creepypasta readings. And so much more. That's at weeklyspooky.com/join. But now, for the situation at hand. When it comes to Christmas, most are hoping for a time of peace, family, and warmth. But sometimes the holidays bring more than just gifts and cheer. They bring things best left forgotten. Tonight's story is about a family gathering that turns into a nightmare when a long-buried secret comes back to haunt them. What starts as a warm holiday homecoming becomes a battle for their lives against an evil far older than Santa Claus. It's time to get cozy as we send you into the holiday weekend with a big dose of fear right after this. Holiday Homecoming Hullabaloo by Joe Solmo. "Hey, Grandpa," came the voice of a child from the other room. The chill, late December air followed as Mark's daughter and grandson entered. A smile crossed his creased face, and his eyes lit up brighter than the Christmas tree adjacent to the big picture window, looking out on suburbia. It had been 5 years since Brandon died, since she lost the love of her life. It took her that long to get herself back into a position to have control on her life, not just emotionally, but financially. It was the first time since the funeral she could come home for a visit to their hometown and where her husband was buried. "Hey there, Bryce. Look how big you got," Mark said, rising from his chair with some effort. His hip was bothering him again. He would have to ask Amy to bring him his prescription when she got back from the store. He gave his grandson a look over. He could see his daughter's face in the one looking back at him. She had the same cherub cheeks separated with a gap-toothed smile when she was 10. He looked up at his daughter, standing in the doorway to the living room. He wondered where the time had gone. She had turned into a woman without him even knowing. He held out his arms, inviting her in. Jennifer rushed to her father. It had been years since she had smelled his aftershave. They stood there, father and daughter, reunited in silence. Only the crackle of the fireplace made a sound. A short moment passed before Bryce started to tug on his mom's jacket. "Mom, I have to use the bathroom," he said in a whiny voice. Jennifer pulled away from her father with a smile. "It's right down the hall, young man," Mark said and held his hand out. "Right this way." Jennifer watched her father lead her son down the same dark wood-paneled walls towards the bathroom. She remembered him walking her down that hall with the same paneling. It might be time to replace it, she thought. She dropped into a worn armchair facing the fire and took a moment to herself, to enjoy the warmth, the silence, and the feeling of being home. She had been so disheveled since the funeral, trying to figure out who she was and where she was going to land. She had barely had a moment to sit and just enjoy life, or even find joy in life, if she was being honest. Her eye drifted over the various knickknacks and bric-a-brac her parents had collected in their 40 years of marriage. Various ceramic figures stood vigilant on wooden shelves in both interior corners of the room, a stark white against the dark walnut paneling. A dancing girl twirling an umbrella was on the top shelf, next to a fisherman holding a rod with a whopper of a fish. Jennifer remembered when she was a child, she had said they were her parents, since her mom loved to dance and her dad spent many Saturdays on the water. A pop in the fireplace grabbed her attention. She stared into the fire, remembering so many years ago, her father stoking that fire as her and her brother would gather to open their presents for Christmas. She wanted that same kind of memory for her son Bryce, but it wasn't meant to be. Bryce couldn't have a Christmas with his father. Why did Brandon have to be such an asshole and die on her, leave her to raise Bryce alone? He said he would always be there for her, but where was he now? Deep down inside, she knew she could face whatever came her way. She just didn't want to face it alone. She missed having him around to bounce ideas off, to make memories with. Hell, just to snuggle with on the couch with a good movie. She wished he was there with her now. She stood up and got closer to the fireplace, looking at the old pictures in stand-up frames on the mantel. Then her eyes fell upon the saw her father had on the mantel on a little stand. It looked old, ancient really. The wood handle sanded smooth except where a sun and moon were carved, forming the grooves for fingers. Her father never spoke of the saw. He never used it. It just sat there as a curious curio from the past. She traced her fingers along the polished metal surface of the blade, careful to keep her fingertips from the sharp teeth. It called to her in some subconscious way. She could almost hear a voice call her name in a breathy whisper. "Jennifer." She wrapped her hand around it. It was warm to the touch. She felt the pulse of life in the wood, like a heartbeat. "Jennifer." That voice, so familiar, like a favorite hoodie or blanket. The words wrapped around her, comforting her. Where did she know it from? "Jennifer, are you okay?" Jennifer gasped and pulled her hand back. She turned to see her mother, looking concerned at her. "Didn't you hear me come in, Jenny?" Amy asked. "No, I guess not," she replied, looking back at the saw resting on its display stand. "Grandma!" came a shrill voice from the hall as Bryce charged into the down coat his grandmother wore. He wrapped his arms around her waist and squeezed so hard she could hardly breathe. "Nice to see you, Bryce," she said in a strained voice. She tried to pry his young arms apart and escape his excited clutch. "Bryce, let your grandma go," Jennifer said, and helped her mom out. "Got any cookies?" Bryce asked. "I might. Let's go to the kitchen and find out. Although I think it's time for lunch," Amy said, leading him away. "Amy, dear, my pills?" Mark asked. "Right away," his wife replied. "Dad, I could have gotten them for you," Jennifer stated. "No big deal. She likes to fuss over me," Mark answered and sat back down where he was before company came. "Have a seat," he finished, gesturing to the chair she was sitting in earlier. "Grandma said come get lunch," Bryce said, entering the room. "I'm not very hungry," Jennifer said, looking up at the mantel. "Grandma said I can't have a cookie until everyone eats lunch," Bryce answered his mom. "Looks like we have no choice," Mark said. "Help your grandfather up." Bryce grabbed his grandfather's sweater sleeve and gave a big yank. He pulled the sleeve half off Mark's arm. "Easy! You gotta hold my hand," Mark said with a chuckle. Bryce did better the second time, and they all went to the kitchen. "Let's go get lunch, then I can take my pills. Supposed to take them with food anyway," Mark finished. "Look, Grandpa! It's snowing!"
Shh, it was only the wind. You're safe. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
As the evening shadows grew, the snow outside began to pile up in large, puffy flakes, the beauty of which was lost on Keiko. She came here, to the mortal realm, for one reason: to get back what was stolen from her people. It was her shame that drove her. It was the perfect time, a fortnight, to get the job done as the days grew their darkest to cross over. It was a long way home, tunneling through the strange rock of this new continent, but she had to return to where it had happened. She eyed the home of her adversary. Many years had gone by since their paths had crossed, since that night so long ago. In fact, this wasn't where it happened at all, and it took years to track him down. 50 years ago, this Christmas Eve, it happened, but she had no concern for mortal calendars. All she knew was that her kind could come out during the 12 days of Christmas while the sun ceases its seasonal movement. For that 2-week span, they could put down their tools and take a break from toiling down in the earth on the roots of the world tree. The last time she was here was a fiasco, one that she was now going to right. Keiko, along with a fire hydrant, made their way across the snow-covered driveway, glancing this way and that. Her greatest fear was that one of this world's dogs would grab her and run off. The hydrant's fear of dogs was a different one altogether. She stood on tippy-toes and looked over the hood of the Buick, but there was no canine in sight. One diminutive hand slid into her pocket, pulling out a small knife. A wicked smile crossed her face. "Grandpa, do you have any good Christmas stories?" Bryce asked with a mouthful of gingerbread cookie. "About Santa?" Mark asked. "No, I've heard all those. Those are boring," Bryce said in an impatient voice. Jennifer noticed her father's glance to the mantel on the fireplace. It was only for a second, but she caught it. "Hey, Dad, Why don't you tell the story of that small saw on the mantel? Even I haven't heard that one, Jennifer prodded. That's not a story I'm particularly proud of, Mark responded with a sigh. He rose to his feet gingerly and walked over to the fireplace. He stared at the fire for a long moment before he spoke again. Well, I'm not getting any younger. It's probably best I get it off my chest. Mark reached up with his weathered hand and wrapped it around the handle, feeling the smooth, worked wood once again in his hands. No species of tree on earth compared to this, he thought, as he looked at the grain, which seemed to shimmer from his touch. He turned and faced his family. It was such a crazy story, an insane night from 5 decades earlier, when he was just a teenager. A story no one believed over the years, so much so that he doubted his own memories, if it wasn't for the saw. A tear raced down his cheek as he looked at it. At first, instinct had told him to take it from her. Then, he decided to keep the thing. He always meant to return it someday. But 1 year turned into another. Then, another. It was Christmas Eve. A 14-year-old Mark was making his way through the snow that covered the streets of suburbia. He was visiting his friend Claudio when Claudio's mother called down to them in the basement. "Mark, your mother wants you to come home," she yelled down the stairs. Mark sighed. Always in the middle of combat, he thought, as he threw his 20-sided dice down on the table. "I gotta go." "If you leave now, you might die," Claudio said with a smirk. Mark knew he was just teasing. He looked around the table at his friends. "Sorry, guys," Mark said, before racing up the stairs and out into the frigid air. He still only had one arm in his coat, since the other held his book bag. He stopped in front of the church on Main Street to put his jacket all the way on. That's when he first saw her. At first, he thought someone had let their kid out alone. The small figure was in the front lawn of the church and ducked behind the hedges that were carved into nativity animals for the holidays. As he made his way in front of the large brick building, he called out to the kid. "I swear if I get hit with a snowball," he started to warn. Then, he heard a sound. He stopped and listened. In the snowstorm, sound was all but silenced, but he heard the rhythmic sound of a saw. What was that kid up to back there? "Hey, kid!" Mark called out and started to walk towards the break in the hedges where the slabs of concrete lead to the front door. "You cutting down their hedges or something?" Mark finished as he rounded a hedge in the shape of a donkey to confront the young child. "What are you up to?" Mark asked the kid, hidden in the shadows of the hedge. The child gasped and turned to face him, its features illuminated in a beam of streetlight. Mark took a step back, unsure what he was looking at. Its eyes showed years beyond comprehension, dark pools of eternity. What he thought was a snowsuit was long brown hair covering its body. He called it an it because it had a long tail that flicked with nervous energy. "What are you?" he whispered in anxious awe. "Keiko," it replied in a feminine voice. "You're Keiko?" Mark asked. There was a hint of wonder in his voice. He was still cautious, but was more curious than anything else.
Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
"Keiko, name," the creature responded, pointing at her chest. That was when he first laid eyes on the saw. It was beautiful. "What are you doing with that saw, Keiko?" he asked. The creature clutched the small cutting tool to her chest, protectively. He looked past her and saw where she had been sawing, into the small trunks of the hedges. Small piles of sawdust lay on the snow. "Give me that!" Mark said, and yanked the saw from Keiko's hand. She growled at him and charged at him with a quickness he was not expecting. Mark backpedaled away a few steps, but when he saw the look on Keiko's face, he thought it best to run. He ran back to the street and looked over his shoulder. Keiko was standing on the edge of the road, and Mark could finally get a good look at her. She had cloven feet, a hairy body, and a tail. She growled at him, and he swore her eyes glowed with a red intensity. He looked down at the saw and thought about chucking it back at her. But for some reason, he thought taking it was the right thing to do, to stop whatever mayhem Keiko was up to. Clomp, clomp. Mark could hear Keiko behind him and gaining fast. Suddenly, a burst of something shot past him and hit a fire hydrant. The hydrant came alive, splitting at the top into a mouth of fangs. It broke free from the concrete and started after him with a metallic clang. "Oh shit!" Mark yelled and ran back across the street, diving through the same hedges he had fled just in time as another blast hit the bush shaped like a camel, and it came to life as well. It lowered its head down towards him and roared with an open, thorny mouth. It vomited a terrified, wide-eyed squirrel at him. Mark fell on his butt, trying to get away from the camel as it tried to lift its legs and uproot itself to give chase. He scooted backwards until his back came to rest on something. The camel, the hydrant, and Keiko were standing at the edge of the church lawn, looking at him. "Oh shit, I am gonna die tonight. Claudio was right," he said through shallow breaths. "Give me back what is mine," Keiko said. "Why are you destroying the hedges?" Mark asked, looking down at the saw he still gripped. "For fun," Keiko replied, and took a few steps closer. "You see, my kind only come to the mortal realm for 12 days a year. We can finally take a break from our labor and come live it up. Causing a little mayhem is just how we blow off steam after a hard year's work," the creature continued. "What do you do for work?" Mark asked, trying to bide him time until he caught his breath and could run away again. "My brothers and sisters and I saw away at the world tree. We were almost through this time. One final push when we get back should do it. But right now, my kin are here with the mortals for a little fun. Give me back my saw!" Keiko snarled. "The world tree? Don't we need that?" Mark asked. In reality, he had never heard of it. "We cut and saw. We make it fall. We saw and cut. The world's kaput." The creature, fire hydrant, and camel sang in unison. "I gotta get out of here," Mark said, and scrambled to his feet, just as Keiko held up a wand and shot another blast at him. He somersaulted out of the way, losing his backpack in the process. He turned to see what the blast had hit, and was horrified as baby Jesus crawled out of the manger with a menacing look. Mark ran through the ankle-deep snow before launching over the hedges and raced home, still clutching the saw in his hand. As the boy made his way down the dark street, Keiko picked up the backpack and rifled through it. She pulled out a hat and lowered it to the crawling baby Jesus and had it sniff it. "Lead me to him, boy," she said, and followed the little savior on the back of a thorny camel. The fire hydrant reluctantly followed behind, having to clang his way through the streets. "Grandpa, did that really happen?" Bryce asked with half a cookie stuffed in his mouth. Everyone had been engrossed in the story. The room had grown dark. The fire was now embers. Jennifer went over to stoke and feed it. "Every word of it," Mark said. "Was it an elf?" Bryce asked. "Oh no, nothing like that. It was a goblin, you see. A Calicantzaros, to be exact. Took me a while to find them at the library, but I eventually did. You see, they spend all year toiling underground, hacking and sawing at the world tree, trying to topple the world. But they get a Christmas vacation, like you do. For the 12 days of Christmas, they come to the surface to cause mayhem. Every year they cause mischief, then return to the world tree to find it had healed itself in their absence, and they have to start all over again," Mark explained. The sound of broken glass came from the kitchen. Jennifer was faster than her parents and made it to the doorway first. She saw the shards of glass laying in the sink as the curtains whipped around in the snowy wind coming through. Then, a small hand gripped the windowsill, and then another. A face peeked out over the sill, straining to lift itself with its tiny nativity arms.
More scares to come. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
There was a pounding on the front door. Jennifer heard everyone gasp. "What is it?" she called back as she opened the closet where her mom kept the brooms and mops. She grabbed the first handle she could find and raised it like a weapon towards the small savior. There's a hydrant at the door," Bryce called back, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "A hydrant?" she called back. "And a grassy camel," the son replied. Jennifer took a deep breath and prepared to fend off the animated child of God. It giggled a child's giggle as saliva dripped off its fanged teeth. It ran a forked tongue over those teeth as its blood-red eyes made contact with Jennifer's. "Not today, baby Jesus," she said and swatted at the tiny trinity with her broom, knocking it back into the sink. She ran up and jabbed it with the wooden handle. The nimble animated nativity set dodged and grabbed with a little hand on the end of the broom handle. It had surprising strength, and it took all that Jennifer had to pull it from his holy grip. She struck back, but he dodged again. She hit the sink so hard it split the wooden handle and made a sharp point. "Mom, they're breaking down the door," Bryce called from the other room. In her manic state, Jennifer's fight-or-flight response removed any intelligent thought and sent her in for the kill as the animated Christ child climbed onto the countertop. It was making its way towards the knife block a few feet away. Jennifer jabbed again with the broken broom handle, this time impaling the side of the diminutive Messiah. She pushed with such force that the nearly weightless porcelain prophet slid across the counter until the exposed broomstick stuck into the wall. Its wicked forked tongue lashed out at her, wrapping around her wrist. She fought to pull back, but the tongue is a strong muscle. She grabbed her arm with her other hand and pulled. She started to make some progress as the saliva-coated muscle began to lose its grip. From the other room, Jennifer heard the door breaking down. She gave a final yank, giving a slip to the tongue. The life left the animated body, and it fell limp. She watched the body for a few seconds before she was satisfied it wouldn't attack again. A golden light illuminated the pierced porcelain child, and a ghostly visage of the baby raised up through the window. She turned her back on the kitchen and started towards the living room. "Jennifer!" She heard the voice again. It stopped her in her tracks. She turned back around. The hairs stood on the back of her neck. She could no longer hear the chaos in the room next door. She could only hear, "Jennifer, there is a way to fix this." Bryce kicked at the fire hydrant as it opened its toothy mouth and puked rusty water at him. It sent him reeling back into his grandfather's chair. He shivered in the cold water as he got back to his feet. He had to protect his grandparents. Mark stood in front of Amy as the camel backed them towards the wall next to the fireplace. In his left hand, he held the saw he had taken so long ago. Where was Keiko? Why hadn't she made an appearance yet? The snarling mouth of the camel monster closed in on Mark, its hot breath the smell of burning leaves. Amy gasped behind him when she realized there was only the wall behind them. "Don't worry, I won't let it hurt you," he reassured her. The camel snipped at him, but he brought the saw up in time. Its wooden teeth gnashed into the metal of the saw. Mark struggled to keep a hold on it as the carnivorous camelid Christmas miracle thrashed its head left and right. He saw bits of sawdust fall as the metal saw bit into the animated hedge. "Leave my grandpa alone!" Bryce called out defiantly and slammed his grandfather's cane into the side of the humped hedge. It lost its balance and fell into the fireplace. A roaring scream erupted from its maw. Smoke billowed out a moment after. The fire began to spread as the incendiary hedge camel thrashed about. Amy and Mark moved out of the way, looking for something to help keep the fire contained. But they need not have worried, for their hero was in the room with them. The hydrant vomited rusty water all over his villainous friend, trying to help. But by the time the fire was out, the drenched dromedary was only a skeleton of branches. Sadness crossed the hydrant's featureless face as it realized his comrade was no longer moving. The family took a moment to catch their breath now that the fire was out, including the original fire in the fireplace. Bryce watched as soot fell onto the wet log. He took a step closer to the fireplace and picked up the poker. A second later, a pair of cloven feet appeared, then legs. Then Keiko crawled out of the fireplace, covered in soot. She looked around at the scene in front of her, a flicker of sadness in her eyes when they fell on the camel. They had been together for 50 years. She turned her attention to Mark and the tool he held in his hand. "It took me a while to find you, but I have. The game is over. I will not be the laughingstock of the Calacantazarii. I need my saw so I can get back to work," Keiko said, and pulled her wand from her belt. She raised it menacingly at Mark and Amy. "Kill it!" Bryce said, connecting the fire poker with Keiko's temple. She crumpled into a pile on the floor. "Bryce!" his grandmother called out. Just then, Jennifer came into the room and reached down and grabbed the wand. She gave a quick look around, like she wanted to say something to her family, but she raced out the door instead. The hydrant followed her, as sentient animated hydrants tend to do. "Mom?" Bryce asked, confused by her actions. "Where are you going?" "Ow, my head!" came Keiko's voice from the floor. Mark quickly wrapped her up in a scarf and tied her to a wet chair. "Now listen to me, Keiko," Mark said, wagging a finger in her face. "I'll give you back this saw, but you have to promise me you will never come back to the surface again. You leave us mortals alone. No deal. Give me what is mine, or I'll have my friends tear you apart." She looked around for her companions, but didn't see any of them. "Where are they?" They're gone. You're all alone. Do we have a deal? Mark asked his nemesis. What's to stop me from agreeing, then coming back anyway? Keiko asked. Your word, Mark said. Give me your word that you will take your saw and leave the mortal realm for good. Fine, Keiko said in defeat. She lowered her head. Mark nodded to Bryce, who untied her. Say that you promise, Mark ordered. I promise on my wand. Keiko patted her pouches and looked up at Mark with a sneer. How did you do it? You stole my wand! Thief! Thief! I will kill you and your whole family! Just then, Jennifer entered the door. Everyone froze in place. There was someone looming behind her in the shadows of the winter night. Dad? Bryce asked the figure. He was shocked as the living room light illuminated his father's face as he stepped inside, a face he thought he would never see again. His father pushed past and came to his son's side. He gave him a smile and took the poker from him. With a suddenness that left everyone in shock, Brandon pierced the heart of Keiko, ending her life. Everyone stood in silence for a moment, looking at the carnage. Bryce wrapped his arms around his father and squeezed tight. Jennifer pulled the wand from her pocket and threw it onto the corpse laying on the floor. Enough of this! It's Christmas Eve after all, Mark said and dragged Keiko's body over to the fireplace. Help me get it lit, will you, Bryce? Together, grandfather and grandson got the fire going, and when the flames were high enough, they tossed Keiko's body, who went up quickly, but smelled like burnt hair. Mark looked over at his wife, Amy, his daughter, Jennifer, and her husband, Brandon. A smile crossed both their faces as they were now reunited. Mark had to assume from the rod that brought things to life. Still clinging to his father was Mark's grandson, Bryce, with the biggest smile of all. Christmas is a time for family, Mark said, and sat in his chair. He barely noticed the fangs on Brandon as he dozed off in his beloved recliner. Looking through the window in the cold, blistery night, a lonely hydrant made an important decision. It was time to see what it could make of itself in this world. He was no longer taking orders. It was, indeed, its own hydrant. Well, my spookies, I hope you enjoyed that special treat Splatter Joe Solmo brought us just for the holidays. I have to say, this one was a lot of fun and definitely a great addition to the Weekly Spooky Christmas season. Now, where's the eggnog? Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really do appreciate it. I had a great time reading this one, and I always have a great time talking with all of you. And I want to remind you, you guys can email me at weeklyspooky@gmail.com for whatever reason, whether it's to comment on the show, suggest a story topic, or whatever drives you to. And I want to say a big, big thank you to all the spookies who've signed up over at Patreon, over 100 of you. It really does mean a lot to me, and I do consider it like a little holiday gift. The Patreon really helps the show grow, and I can't tell you how much it means to have that security as I do a podcast for a good half of my week for all of you. And speaking of my other job, if you need a Christmas movie to watch that's family-friendly, head over to Tubi or the Roku channel and type in A Bulldog for Christmas. You might just enjoy it. And I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are Jessica Fuller, Johnny Nix, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Brent McCullough, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much for your support, and if you want to hear your name at the end of every episode of Weekly Spooky, just head to weeklyspooky.com/join and select a tier at $15 a month or higher. Not only will you hear your name through my spooky, silky smooth voice, but you'll be making a big difference on keeping the podcast going for another 5 years. Now it's time for me to get back to work because many of you also are working your butts off before Christmas, and I want to make sure you're fully entertained during it. So for myself, for my executive producers Rob Fields, Mark Shields, and Bobbletopia.com, my composer Ray Mattis, and my good buddy and producer Dan Wilder, well, I'll be talking to you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.